So this paper, it's the second time I presented. I always have a little bit of trouble because I'm not really used to presenting only conceptual papers with no data. So you'll have to bear with me if I don't do the best of performances in this case. So this is my attempt at kind of tackling the problem of defining what we mean in the project and more generally for this research agenda with responsiveness, and also how to both think about it conceptually, but how to analyze it in the future from a theoretical point of view. So the paper and the presentation moves in several steps. I first will give you a kind of short account of the motivations, the goals, and the questions. Then I spend quite a bit of space and time, space in the paper and time in the presentation around the concept of responsiveness and what is responsiveness and what do we mean with the concept of responsiveness, and then address, and this I will do a little bit more in a shorter sort of way in the presentation, although I think I can expand sufficiently on it in the paper, on when ought governments to be responsive between elections and what are the normative implications and the debate around it. And then as a third sort of linked question is when governments are likely to be responsive. So regardless of when they ought to be responsive between elections from a normative point of view, what is the empirical debate that we have and how are we approaching this questions of when are they actually likely to be responsive. And I finished with some expectations for future research and kind of more generally the expectations that we use for the research agenda. So the motivations, goals and questions I want kind of deal with a lot of this because I've mentioned some of it in the introduction to the project. So there's a vast increasing empirical scholarship on governmental responsiveness, but there's much less conceptual and theoretical elaboration on what responsiveness is and actually in which situations this tension between the normative expectations about when we ought to expect governments to be responsive and when we actually expect them to be in empirical terms has not been discussed very much, surprisingly. Maybe because there's a sort of an implicit understanding of what responsiveness is, but I'm not sure that actually everyone is talking about the same thing when we're dealing with empirical work. So I find it useful as an exercise for my own sake to sort of scan the scholarship and look at what people are understanding with responsiveness. And then there's a kind of more instrumental role of the paper in that the main goal is to provide a conceptual and theoretical framework that will then help us do the empirical work and understand the data that we're collecting. So the main research questions that I address in this paper are, of course, clearly connected to the overall research questions of the project, and those are related to how often we should expect representative governments to respond to the public's wishes and in which circumstances, but also who is the public that is being represented or to which governments are responding, and what is the normative and tensions and relations between the existence of electoral pledges and mandates and our expectations, both theoretically, kind of from a normative point of view, but also empirically of when governments will actually be wanting or likely to be responsive. So starting with Hannah Pitkin's work, because of course it's foundational work in the whole discussion about representation and by extension also of the work on responsiveness. Pitkin's idea is that representation is acting in the interest of the represented in a manner that is responsive to them. But quite interesting, Pitkin doesn't really define what she means by responsiveness, or how much responsiveness do we need for a government to be considered representative? And it's quite interesting that actually, because Pitkin defines representation as relating to interests rather than preferences or demands, then the whole discussion is complicated by the whole notion of who knows best what is the interest of the represented, and there's this strong normative tension relating to the definition of interest and how they might be not the same as demands. And actually, she justifies governments not being responsive if that's in the best interest of those represented, and the discussion about collective interest is quite important. Overall, I mean, beyond Pitkin's work, one of the main problems is that we rarely discuss in a kind of explicit way and in detail what exactly we mean by responsiveness. And in the paper, I go into much detail about different ways of defining responsiveness, but some of the work done by Powell is quite illuminating in this sense, because Powell understands responsiveness as a set of institutional configurations that allow governments to produce and implement policies in a way that they match what citizens want. So more than a specific sets of reactions or ways of interacting with the public, Powell is understanding responsiveness as a set of institutional configurations. So we're not always understanding responsiveness in the same ways, and very often we find in the empirical literature kind of a use of the term that is interchangeable with that of congruence. Now, my argument in these papers is that is problematic for several reasons. One is that we should try to avoid using several concepts for the same underlying notion, just as kind of probably a good practice, but also because the way in which we understand congruence, this can be motivated or can be caused by a number of different kind of situations. First of all, constituents might be choosing representatives who match their preferences. So when both the representatives and the represented are congruent in terms of their intentions, their behaviors, this might be because constituents are quite smart in choosing who represents them to match their preferences. It can be also because representatives who are not sharing the preferences are constrained somehow by other factors to follow policies that are consistent with the preferences of their constituents. It could be as well because representatives are persuading their constituents to share their preferences, or it could be because external factors are changing simultaneously the views of and the preferences of the constituents and the representatives, or finally because representatives are adapting their policy behaviors and decisions to views of the constituents. So there are a wide range of situations that can lead to congruence, and what I argue in this paper is that only the latter should be called responsiveness, that we should only conceive of responsiveness as something that implies adaptation in the policy behaviors, regardless of what representatives truly believe in or what their real preferences are, if they adapt their policy behaviors to match those of the constituents. So my main argument is that responsiveness requires, first of all, that the views or the preferences over the issue differ between the constituents and the representative, and that the representative adapts or changes their position to reflect these diverging views or preferences in comparison listen to the constituents. And a starting assumption, of course, of this notion of responsiveness is that in most cases the representative, in the case that we're interested in for this project, governments as collective representatives, that they hold an opinion and they have a preferred policy. So in that sense, if they are to be responsive, this requires change in what they're doing. Now, sometimes the representative will not have a firm preferred policy. My assumption is that does not occur that often, so it can happen sometimes, but because of the nature of political parties, or in the case in which we're looking into governments, it's quite rare that they will not have some position on issues unless the issue is really new. But in those cases, I understand responsiveness as requiring adopting the preferred policy of the constituents in the absence of a preferred policy. So in a sense, it's still change from no position to the position that the constituents hold. So once I've sort of put forward this notion of responsiveness, then the second question is, how can we measure governmental responsiveness with this view of what responsiveness is? And here the paper argues that there are multiple forms in which governments can respond to policy demands. There's been quite a debate about whether, for example, rhetorical reactions should be considered responsiveness or not. And there's a strand of the literature that argues that rhetorical responsiveness should be regarded as a kind of full-fledged form of responsiveness if we take a deliberative view of democracy and representation. I argue instead that rhetorical reactions matter, but that this is a minimalist view of responsiveness. And I think that it's just one step in kind of a wider processual view of responsiveness. So what I'm proposing in this paper is to view responsiveness as a series of steps or stages. I'm not sure if you will be able to see the text at the end of the room, but pretty much I'm conceiving of this as a kind of number of stages and strategic but also interactive stages between, in this case, governments, which are the focus of attention in our project. And the starting point is that there's either a status quo or that the government initiates a policy reform. And when that happens, two things can then happen. There might be no opposition from the public, or there can be some form of opposition from the public. If opposition happens, then the government has two choices. It can ignore the opposition and just go on and with their preferred course of action, or it can acknowledge this opposition, listen to the opposition, and discuss their own position and the position of those that are against their preferred policy. So that would constitute already a first, in my view, in my proposal, a first stage in the process of responsiveness. That is already increased attention, and it's a first very, very minimal way of understanding that governments are reacting towards what are the demands of the public and different sectors of the public. After that, then things can happen. After increasing attention and acknowledging the opposition, the government can still continue with their preferred policy, or the government could yield in a number of ways to the opposition. One would be by continuing formal deliberations, and this is what I argue would constitute a form of rhetorical responsiveness, or they could yield by changing the policy course. And then, of course, the kind of different ways that this interaction could go on, even after yielding from a rhetorical point of view, then the government could still continue with their preferred policy and just having deliberated more about the policy and decided to stick with their original preferred policy. Or they could that could lead then to some form of change in the policy course. Now, the way I view it is that these can then take different forms. Some policy changes might be minor, as in just changing specific small elements of the policy. So in the case that we're looking in Fukushima, to give you an example, decide just to not open new plants in the future, but stick with the nuclear energy policy as it stands. Or the change could be substantial. It could be, like in the Fukushima case that we're studying, a decision to phase out nuclear energy in a relatively short period of time. And of course, all these processes can fit back, and that kind of the gray arrows that I'm showing kind of start again the process in a kind of iterative way. So following this processual understanding of responsiveness, what I propose in the paper is an ordinal conceptualization of responsiveness, so that we have a range of options through which governments can be responsiveness, from no reaction and no change to small gradual forms of reaction that increasingly move towards a kind of full-fledged responsive reaction. Now, I'm running out of time, so I won't go into the details of this, but I just wanted to highlight that the paper discusses the normative tensions, and there are three problems from a normative point of view that are actually also problems that we need to tackle when looking at responsiveness from an empirical point of view. One is the discussion in political theory about whether representatives should be autonomous and independent, or whether they should be acting as delegates, and they should be following the mandate of the public. And that's actually a problem from not just from a normative point of view, but also from an empirical point of view, because politicians do have different understandings of what's their role in terms of political representation. And in a kind of a further draft, I intend to show how actually this works with both party rep data on representatives, but also a European project, In Tune, has done a survey of MPs across a number of countries, and you can actually see that there are huge differences across countries in the understandings that MPs have of their role and how independent they should be. So that should lead not just to normative tension, but also to different expectations across countries, depending on these normative understandings of the roles. A second problem that is both common to normative debates and empirical debates is around diversity of the constituents' views. And there's very often a fiction that it's been done implicitly or explicitly as if there is a single principle to which representatives should be responding or reacting. But in fact, what we find is a huge heterogeneity of preferences of different sectors of the public. And here it's where the empirical problem that this project tries to tackle becomes important. To whom should representatives be paying attention? To whom should they be reacting, especially when these views of the public are in contradiction? And the final, both normative and empirical tension, is relating to how to learn about these views and how governments actually get truthful signals of what the people want. So moving from this, then this paper and the project looks into, regardless of these normative understandings, when are governments actually likely to be responsive. And of course, we view governments as anticipators, so their reactions will be contingent to a number of factors, among which the saliency of the issue, the size of the potential electoral loss, the closeness to the elections. But we also need to view governments governments as constrained by other aspects. Some of these are relating to the policy-making process itself, so not at all points of the policy process can governments actually backtrack and change their minds. There's a number of constraints relating to the process of decision-making. Other constraints are external. They're relating to reputation. Sometimes international reputation is quite important in constraining the actions of governments, but there are contractual constraints as well. And very often governments will be constrained by their own internal party or coalition dynamics and the preferences of the parties and coalitions that support them. So moving from those discussions of the empirical kind of constraints and anticipations that governments do, we have a set of behavioral expectations on governmental responsiveness in empirical terms, and these are the ones that we will be looking into for the project as a whole and in the papers that you will be seeing from now on. First, we argue that in the absence of protest, then governments will have very little incentive to respond to the public, even if what the median voter wants clearly signals that they are on the other side of the spectrum to what the government wants to do. And then we have a number of expectations that are conditional on the configuration of the opinion of the median voter. If the protest is substantial but it's inconsistent with the median voter, then we expect that the reaction will be conditional on whether the government is a single-party government or coalition government, and whether protesters are in line with the core voters of the main party. If protest is substantial and it's consistent with the median voter, then in those cases we expect responsiveness to be much more likely. And we expect all these expectations to be conditional on how close election day is. So I'll finish there, reminding you again about the website of the project, and thanks.